I would like to, some of you are tardy. I would like to now introduce, and he's very kind to do this for me, because I love putting these seminars together. If you were here yesterday, you saw it was a lot of heart that went into that, and I was blessed by these people who are with me and who come to my call. And I say, please, we want to do something different every time for a seminar that will engage you and draw you further into the world of ragtime, traditional jazz, and whatever else. So we have a real treat, and I've worked with him before. From England, Neville Dickey, who is going to tell us his story of how he's in ragtime, and hopefully some things about what it was in England and Europe and what it is now, but mostly it's about Neville. So, thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I thought there would have been a few more here to hear about the music in England. Where did they all go? They obviously listened to the Jeff Barnard. Anyway. This is a little bit about English ragtime and how I came into ragtime. If you find it boring, just shout out, boring, and go and get your money back. I don't like talking about myself, but I'll just tell you about how I came into ragtime. I had, by the way, excuse the jacket, I thought it was going to be -5 like it was in England. And I came prepared. Yeah, I had lessons for 4 years. My mother bought me a piano, not me, my brother and sister and myself. And she spent £10 on a piano. Well, in about 1950, that was a lot of money. That was a week's wages, which we couldn't really afford. And she doesn't know why she did it, but she wanted us all to have piano lessons. My brother and sister can't play at all. And so I used to have lessons from the age of 7 till 11. I hated practicing, and my mother used to put an alarm clock on the piano and set it for half an hour. And she said, you sit down there and play for half an hour. And when the alarm clock went off, I was free. So the time came when she said, I'm wasting my money here. I'm going to stop your lessons, which he did do. And then, of course, I found the freedom to play what I wanted, because my piano teacher was a classical teacher. And so I started sitting down and picking up the pops of the day. And we had a very limited record collection, my parents. And one of the tunes, I suppose the first time I ever heard what I'd class as not strictly ragtime, but anybody heard of Johnny Maddox? Johnny Maddox was, in 1951, he recorded a 78 called Humoresque. It's one of the few records my parents had at home. And that was the first time I heard sort of pseudo-ragtime, I suppose you'd call it. Little did I know that years and years later I'd be corresponding with Johnny Maddox, because he's still alive, living in Texas. I think he's 92 now. But Humoresque was the first tune I heard. And my father, he never used to compliment me on much, you know, pretty strict. But I knew he loved this Humoresque. And I used to sit down and play stuff, and he'd never say anything. And one day he came in from work, and I was sitting at the piano, and I was playing Humoresque. And he turned to my mother and he said, by God, that lad can play. Because I was playing his tune. And it taught me a lesson afterward, because I don't ask people for requests because usually you don't know the tune or you don't like playing it. You'll find that with most piano players. I learnt my lesson the hard way because the tune they always requested was their favourite but not yours. And if you didn't know it, they never spoke to you again, you know. You were the worst piano player in the world. Anyway, this is, you can look on YouTube. Johnny Maddox, as I say, recorded this humoresque. It became a million seller. And he recorded for the Dot label. The Dot label was a small record label. And I think it was 1951. You can hear it on YouTube, of course. You can hear everything on YouTube. And he recorded it, I think it was with trio, piano, bass, drums. And he became known as Mr. Dot because he made so much money for the Dot record company. And of course, after that, he began to record sing-along medleys, as we would call them. But he did tell me that we corresponded. He didn't have email or a computer. And he did tell me that when he recorded this humoresque, on the other side was a medley of tunes. But the humoresque one was his arrangement, so he got royalties for that. But he told me on the other side, because it was a medley, they have to last a certain length of time. I think it's over 1 minute. And they don't get royalties for that. So he got the royalties for both sides of the record. And he made a fortune from it. This is how it sounded. I haven't got any rhythm with me, but this is humoresque as he did it. Thank you. Well, that was humoresque. In my younger days, I used to play the church organ for the local church. And I was only 16 at the time, and I took over from a church organist who was sort of in his 80s. But I always remember I used to play for the church service on a Sunday morning. And he always used to say to me, "You're playing too slow." And I can never get the hang of that. I thought I played them too quick. But the funny thing was, it was big pipe electric organ, and my father used to sit by the side of the organ, and there was a pump there, and if the electric was cut off, as it was often in those days, he'd pump the piano up as I was playing, and he didn't get paid, neither did I. But I used to go along to a friend's house, and he had a record collection of stuff like big band, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Jimmy Lunceford, all that sort of stuff. And one day he put a record on, and when I heard this, I loved it. It was James P. Johnson playing a tune called Romania, and it was a piano roll. And on the other side of 78 was Fats Waller playing Laughing Crying Blues. And I loved this, I loved them both, but I loved Romania's particularly. But I can never understand, it used to speed up towards the end of the 78. And I found out in later years, because 78s wouldn't take 4 minutes, they were usually about three and a half maximum, the piano roll lasted 4 minutes, so they had to speed it up to get it onto the 78. So that's when I really first heard my taste of ragtime. I suppose I was about 16 at the time. And then we had a lady come from Trinidad to play in England called Winifred Atwell. I don't know if you've heard of Winifred Atwell, black lady who came to record. And she signed up with an agent who actually was my agent later on. But she came over and she played boogie woogie and ragtime. She came to record a tune called the Cross Hands Boogie. That was her big feature. So they said, well, what should we do on the other side? So the producer said, well, what about something like a ragtime, black and white rag or something like that? And in the studio, they had an out-of-tune piano, like we do on many of the places over here. And she recorded the black and white rag, and it got lots of airplay. The other side, the one she recorded, Cross Hands Boogie, nobody wanted to know about, but everybody loved the black and white rag. And it became a #1 bestseller. And of course, I was about 16 or 17. When I heard this record, I loved it. And I bought the music and learned to play it. I'll play it how she recorded it. It wasn't a very subtle arrangement, but anyway, she recorded it. And she used to tour the music halls of the theatres in England on a regular basis. And she used to have 2 pianos. One was an ordinary piano. The other one she called her other piano, which was the out-of-tune piano. And she used to take that all around the country with her, and they'd wheel it on stage, and it was specifically tuned out of tune, if you know what I mean. This is the sort of thing she did with the black and white rag. Thank you. Okay. I was mad on Winifred Atwell. Every piece, she composed a lot of ragtime pieces. Nobody ever plays now. Britannia Rag, Coronation Rag, lots of stuff. Jubilee Rag. Anyway, I'll continue with my life story, and I'm glad to see most people are still here. At the age of 17, I met a clarinet player, and we formed a quartet based on the Benny Goodman quartet. And there was a guy who used to tour England, the theatres, with a talent show. And you'd enter the talent show and went on stage, and then if you were any good, you'd get into the next round. And anyway, cut a long story short, we won. We got into the final and won the final. And your prize for doing that was a trip to London and appearing on TV. That would be in, when was that? 1954. Most people didn't have TVs in those days in England. And anyway, we had to go down to London, and I went to a few jazz clubs in London because I lived in Durham, which was 300 miles north of London. And I loved London, and I thought, this is the place for me. So when we got back from London, I said to my parents, right, that's it, I'm off to London. And I think I had £10 in my pocket. I went to stay with a friend of mine who, he was a trombonist, and he lived in London, so I stayed with him. Got a few jobs in pubs in London. And then I thought, I'll go along for a BBC audition. Guess what? I failed. Failed miserably. So I carried on playing with jazz bands and playing in pubs. And I used to play in a rough area of London called Notting Hill. Well, of course it's a posh area now. It's amazing how places have changed. But if you live in Notting Hill now, you're upper class. In those days, I'd be playing in a pub in Notting Hill, and somebody would jump over the piano and rob the till of the money, you know. So it was pretty rough. Anyway, a few years went by, and I thought, I'll have another audition at the BBC. So I applied, and this time I passed. I was lucky because you go into a studio for an audition at the BBC, and it's a studio probably half as big as this theatre. And all there is a grand piano. There's a glass screen at the back with 3 judges sitting there, and they decide on your life, the rest of your life, whether you're going to pass or fail. And I always remember, because you only get 15 minutes, by the way. You had 15 minutes to show what you could do. So I played a couple of numbers. I always remember this lady coming up with a tray, and she said, "Would you like a cup of tea, sir?" I'll never forget that. I said, "No, I just want to get this over with." So I did my 15 minutes, and I remember I played Ain't Misbehavin'. I can't remember what else. But I also played a tune by James P. Johnson called the Harlem Strut. And I'd learnt that from the record, because in those days you couldn't get the music in England for all this ragtime stuff and stride stuff. You had to learn it from records. But I'll play a tune that was one of the tunes on the audition. I think 1921, James P. Johnson's Harlem Strut. Okay, well, I passed this audition, and then this lady came up to me after I'd played the audition. She said, would you like to do some stuff for the BBC? And I said, well, I'd love to, you know. And there was a consumer program on BBC Radio every morning of the week. And it was on from about, I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning till midday. And they had a guy on there who he'd interview politicians and give the recipe of the day and all that crap, you know. Sorry, that's an American word, I shouldn't say that. Oh. I learned it when I was over here. Anyway, I used to go up to Maida Vale and I'd record 12 numbers every couple of months, and they'd play a couple every morning, and they'd repeat them, and then I'd go up and do some more. What amazed me was that they'd provide the bass player and drummer, and these musicians, they just amazed me, because the bass player, I was playing ragtime and all that sort of stuff, a few standards, and you know, you'd have the chords written out, and these musicians, I mean, they were working at the BBC all day. Some of them were working 5 sessions a day. They'd start at 9 in the morning. Well, he actually showed me his diary, this bass player. 9 in the morning till 11 with an orchestra, and then 12 till 2 with a trio, and 3 till 4 with something else. And of course, they could read music like fly shit, if you excuse another American expression. Fly, you know, that's what they call it on the paper, the music. You put it down in front of them. They didn't need a rehearsal. They'd just play this stuff, and that used to amaze me. And it was a great shame, because when the Beatles came along, all these sessions were finished, and all these fabulous musicians who played for the BBC, they became obsolete. But anyway, I started recording stuff, and you can imagine 12 numbers every couple of months. After about a year, I started struggling to find new material. And that's when I started playing a lot of obscure ragtime stuff. And my mother wrote to me, and she said, remember that tune you used to play that your music teacher taught you, called The Robin's Return? I said, yeah. And she said, why don't you record that for the BBC? I said, no. I said, it's too old-fashioned. It was written in 1876. And anyway, I thought about it, and when I was looking for tunes to play, I thought, well, I'll have a go at that, because The Robin's Return, it originally written something like this. So I put a beat to it. I often think, you know, this is probably ragtime in its earliest form, 1876, because when you listen to this, I put a beat to it, and it has 3 themes, and it sounded very much like ragtime to me. Anyway, apparently the BBC were inundated with telephone calls when they heard it. And everybody was ringing up saying, hey, my mother used to play that. My granddad used to play that. My great-grandmother used to play that. Where can I get this record? Well, I hadn't recorded it. So I'll play the tune anyway, see what you think. But 1876, put a beat to it and you can turn it into ragtime. Robin's Return. Anyway, I eventually, the recording guy came up and said, well, there were so many requests for it. He said, record the Robin's Return, sign a contract with me. And I signed a contract with Norman Newell, who was the recording manager, to do 5 LPs. And the first one was, well, obviously, it was originally called Introducing Neville Dickey. Then, because the Robin's Return became popular, they retitled it The Robin's Return. Then I did a Fats Waller LP, which is probably the worst Fats Waller LP you've ever heard. Then I did another one called I Love a Piano, which wasn't much of an improvement. And then I did, they said, what do you want to do next? I said, well, this is in the 70s. I said, well, Ragtime is very popular in America. So I said, I think we ought to do a Ragtime LP. So that's what we did. And we called it Rags to Riches. And he said, do you know a tune called Rags to Riches? I said, no. He said, well, bloody compose one. So I had this, composing wasn't one of my great attributes, but I composed a piece called we called the LP Rags and Tatters, that was it. And he said, do you know a tune called Rags and Tatters? And I said, no. So I had to compose a piece called Rags and Tatters. And that was a tune that was on the album, and we called the album Rags and Tatters. One of my very few attempts at writing music. It was what you'd call novelty piano. And if you listen closely, you'll find another 1,000 tunes hidden in there. That I listened to bits and pieces from other tunes. Here's Rags and Tatters. I think, when would it be? 1976, I think. Okay, as I say, I was learning a lot of new tunes to play for the BBC. Fortunately, there was a book came out, I believe it was in the 70s, by Max Morath called 100 Classic Ragtime Pieces. Anybody have that one? And it was big, thick folio. I think it cost me, it was something like $28 or something, including postage. And I saw Max Morath last year at the West Coast Ragtime Festival. I said, "Hey Max, I got your folio in 1976. I sent you $30 and never got the change." And he said, "Sorry about that, but I'll get you a drink instead." Anyway, so I was doing all this ragtime stuff and on radio, and at least one guy, ragtime pianist, he emigrated to Switzerland. He couldn't stand the fact that I was getting all the work on BBC. He was a ragtime pianist, and he actually left the country because of me. He's still living in Switzerland now. He couldn't stand the fact that I was getting all the work. But if you see in the program, they actually made two mistakes in the program here, if you read in there. They've spelt my name wrong for a start. And the other thing is, it ends up by saying, Neville Dickey will be telling you why ragtime is still popular in Europe. And it's not. So they made two mistakes. And the reason ragtime isn't popular in Europe, because everybody spelt your name wrong. So anyway, there you go. Then I made an LP on the Euphonic label. Dave Jason was he's still alive. He's a ragtime historian, and he used to play piano. He doesn't play anymore. But he heard some of my stuff on BBC, and he said, I'd like to do an LP, you on one side, me on the other. So I said, yeah, that'll be fine. So we recorded some stuff for this LP on the Euphonic label. Didn't get paid any money for it, but I'm glad eventually that my side of the LP sold a hell of a lot more than his. And he regrets that to this day. But we did this LP, and he said, eventually, he said, would you like to come to America? He said, I'm organizing a concert on Long Island, where he lived, and I'm going to call it From Rags to Riches. This was 1976. So I said, yeah, I'd love to come. So he'd booked Trevor Tishner, you remember Trevor? Virginia's father, of course. Dick Hyman, Dick Wellsted, Bob Seeley, Joe Fingers Carr, do you remember him? And myself. So it was going to be a big concert in this theatre that held about 2,000 people. So if that's my agent, tell him I'm not here. Anyway, I booked my ticket, my airfare, to come to Long Island. Long Island. And he phoned me about a week before, and he said, we're going to have to cancel the concert. I said, I bought my ticket, you know. He said, well, I've had a word with John Wilson, who was the jazz critic in the New York Times, and he said he's going to try and get us a piece, an article in the New York Times, and see what happens. Anyway, there was a big half-page article. He phoned me a few days later. He said, we okay? He said that they had a half-page article in the New York Times. He said the tickets are going like wildfire. And eventually they sold, I think, something like 500 tickets, so everything went okay. But one of my idols when I was a kid was Joe Finger's Car. And I think his big hit over here was a tune called Sam's Song. Do you remember that? He also did The Ivory Rag. And he made a lot of LPs. And when we went for dinner afterwards, Dave Jason sat me beside one of my heroes, Joe Finger's Car. Sadly, he was killed in a car crash a couple of years later. But a very modest guy. He worked for a record company, and he just used to churn out these LPs of ragtime marches and all that sort of stuff. A brilliant musician. But they were often on out-of-tune pianos again, honky-tonk pianos. So I don't think he got the recognition he deserved. Anyway, I flew in on the Saturday to do this concert, and flew back home on the Sunday, and it was all over. That was my first visit. And then a few years later, I was playing in the Pizza Express in London. It's a jazz venue, and Dick Wellstead, I don't know if anybody remembers Dick Wellstead, wonderful piano player. And he heard me play, and he said, would you like to come to America? To Hanratty's. Anybody been there? That was a restaurant in Manhattan. I think it was on 91st Street, 3rd or 2nd Avenue. And it was a lovely little restaurant. And the food was great. The Mississippi mud pie was wonderful. And that's what happened, you see. But I did a 3-week residency at Hanratty's, and then I started to pick up other work. Somebody asked me to do the festival on the Goldenrod Showboat. Do you remember that, on the Mississippi? And so I tied that up because that was about a week earlier than the Scott Joplin Festival. So I used to do that, and then the Scott Joplin Festival. Then I'd come up to Manhattan and work up there. So I started to get a little circuit going there. And then the recording guy came up to me and he said that Bob Erdus, do you remember him? He ran Stump Off Records, and he said, would you like to do an LP? That was in 1982. So I recorded my first LP for Stump Off, and then that's the only record label I recorded for. I think I did 4 LPs and about 10 CDs for Bob. Sadly, he died last year. But let me see. Oh yeah, I used to do the Hot Steam Festival as well. Anybody been to that one? That used to be a good one in Connecticut. And then, of course, somebody invited me to do the Costa Mesa Festival in Orange County, which was a good one. I did that for a few years. In the meantime, let me tell you that I love you. No, what time is it? I'll tell you a little bit about a jazz club I ran with my wife for 27 years in Sutton in Surrey. And we used to have it monthly, and I'd have a resident trio, and we'd invite musicians there. And I always remember it taught me a lesson because in the early days we'd only been running about a couple of months, and this guy rang up. He said, "There's this fantastic guitarist from Ireland, Louis Stewart." He said he's played with Benny Goodman, and he's great. Would you have him at your jazz club? I said, "Well, what does he play?" He said, "Well, modern jazz." I said, "Well, it's not really our type of music, but I said, okay, we'll accommodate him." He said, "I'm trying to line up a tour for him." So I said, okay. So he turned up at the jazz club, the guitarist. He plunked his guitar. He was about 2 hours early. He plunked his guitar down, and he's walking like this. And he toddled off. He said, "I'll be back in about an hour." Or in an Irish accent, he said, "I'll be back in an hour." So he comes back, and he's even worse. He'd been drinking all day. I didn't know this. So he goes on the stage with his guitar, starts to play numbers that nobody's ever heard. And for the first 3/4 of an hour, he played his own compositions and didn't announce them at all. Well, you know, you like a bit of interaction between the musician. And I said to him in the interval, "Louis," I said, you got to tell him what you're going to play." And he just looked at me blankly. And he just carried on playing. And people were walking out. We'd got some new members that night, and they came in for 1/4 of an hour and buggered off. They'd had enough. And at the end, I paid them, and I said, "Louis, there you are, you know. You got to learn to talk to an audience." And I'll never forget his final words. He said, "I hate your effing Mickey Mouse music anyway." So I learnt a lesson there, and I never booked modern jazz musicians again. So we gave up the club a couple of years ago. I mean, jazz clubs are closing everywhere, as you know. Over here, festivals are closing. And it's a struggle to keep people interested in our kind of music, but I hope they continue doing. I'll just finish off by, I had the honor of playing for, 3 or 4 years ago, a friend of mine had given my name to Princess Alexandra, who lives in Richmond Park in London, and her secretary got in touch with me. She said, "Could you come and play for our party for Princess Alexandra?" So I said I'd be delighted. So anyway, Princess Alexandra contacted me, and she said, "Can you come over for coffee 2 days before the concert, before the party? Try the piano out." And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." So went over to Richmond Park, and of course she had this lovely place and grand piano. And she said, "Sit down and have a cup of coffee." And I did. And she said, "Now, try the piano out, see what you think." I said, "Yeah, it's pretty good." She said, "Now, will you need it varnished for Saturday?" Most people say, "Do you want a tune?" She asked me if I wanted it varnished. She was serious. And anyway, I had the honor of playing for her last year for her 80th birthday. Funny enough, she was born on Christmas Day, and I was born a week later, New Year's Day. But her brothers, they're always there. Prince Michael of Kent and the Duke of Kent. I don't know if any of you watch Wimbledon tennis, but at the end of the final of the tennis at Wimbledon, you always get these big guys, about 6'4". That's the Duke of Kent. He presents the cup to the winner. But Prince Michael of Kent, he's a bit more laid back, and I'll never forget the first time he was there at one of Princess Alexandra's parties. He came up and he said, do you know a tune called Honey Hush? Well, fortunately, it's a Fats Waller tune. Anybody that was at the concert last night, somebody played Honey Hush. I can't remember who. But I'm going to finish off with that number. And the story goes, Fats Waller composed very little when he came to England. But he did compose Honey Hush. And the story goes that he was on his way on a liner to England. And they had a piano on board, of course, and Fats Waller's playing. And this lady came up and she tapped him on the shoulder. She said, Mr. Waller, I think you're wonderful. And he said, oh, honey, hush. Anyway, the following morning, they're sitting at breakfast. Andy Razaf, who was Fats Waller's manager, he's sitting with Fats Waller and they're having breakfast. Finished breakfast, Fats Waller goes and sits down at the piano and just composes a number like he did in 5 minutes. And of course, he said to his manager, what should we call it? Of course, Honey Hush. And every time when Prince Michael of Kent is around, he always asks for this number. So I always play it for him. So that's what I'm going to finish off with. It's a nice Fats Waller tune. I think he recorded it about 1935. Thanks to everybody. Is everybody still awake? Yeah? Oh, I must say I was asked to quickly tell you the state of ragtime in Europe. Well, there just isn't any ragtime players. That's the truth of it. You go to Germany and Switzerland, you'll hear loads of boogie-woogie piano players. There's all these young kids. And I always remember, I must tell you a story. I was playing at the Boogie-Woogie Festival over there in Switzerland, and this guy came up and he said, have you heard this young kid? He's 14 years old. He said, open that door and have a look. And there he was, this God. You know, he was hitting every note in sight. Fantastic piano player. And anyway, when we shut the door and went to sit down, he was a jazz critic, this guy. He said, what do you think? I said, God, it's fantastic. He said, you know the difference? I said, what? He said, he is good. You play from the heart. He doesn't. But there's all these young kids playing boogie-woogie in Europe. There's no ragtime. You see, ragtime is a specialized form of music, and very rarely you'll get somebody who wants a ragtime pianist playing all night. That's how I've got by, because I'm not the best boogie-woogie player in the world. I'm not the best ragtime pianist. But I try and play a bit of everything, and that's how I get by. In other words, I'm rubbish at everything. But I've managed to fool the public. Now I'm going to play, thanks for everybody coming along, and hope to see you around. This is Honey Hush by Fats Waller. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Angel.
Mr. Neville Dickey flew over here just for us. Wasn't that lovely? Almost, but yes. Thank you.